And when I was walking to Capitol Hill every day for work, I would pass by the same folks who were unhoused and realized, you know what, I don't need to go to a developing nation to tackle this problem. There's plenty of hunger and food insecurity in our backyard. And that really shaped the trajectory of my career.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Book Leads Impactful Books for Life and Leadership. I'm your series host and leadership performance coach, John Jaramillo. This podcast series is about getting to the books that have impacted the lives of the people in my network. So these are great leads that I'll be having these conversations with to get to those books that have impacted their life, their work, their mission, whatever it may be. All those worlds intersect. And my guest today is Katie Martin. And Katie is a thought leader on food insecurity and has spent over 30 years developing and researching programs to promote healthy food access and long-term food security. She's the CEO of More Than Food Consulting, whose goal is to advance organizational and systems change to tackle the preventable problem of hunger. And Katie's also the author of Reinventing Food Banks and Pantries. Katie, thank you so much for being here for this conversation.
It's my pleasure.
So Katie, obviously read the bio. We have a sense of who you are, the work that you're doing, but who are you today in your day-to-day? What is the mission that your bio kind of hints at? What does that day-to-day work look like with the people that you serve?
Yeah, so at More Than Food Consulting, we do consulting with primarily nonprofits, and largely those are food banks and food pantries and other community organizations or universities that are partnering with food banks and food pantries. And we provide trainings, technical assistance, all around better practices that are evidence-based. And from that evidence, knowing these are better ways to provide hunger relief.
So to understand how you came to be, who's sitting in front of us doing the work that you're doing, can you walk me through what got you here? I like to start around the time that somebody maybe goes into college or goes into workforce. But what are the major milestones or pivot points in your path to now that kind of set you up to be where you are, who you are today?
Yeah, it's a great starting point, and that's exactly where I usually start. When I was in college, I was at Indiana University studying political science and thought that I might want to go into the Peace Corps, maybe travel internationally to help people. Didn't know exactly what that was going to look like, and thought it would be a good idea to try to do an internship with a politician so that I could understand that work. And I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, and my congressman from Dayton, Ohio was named Tony Hall. And I was fortunate to get an internship with him during college. And he had been a lifelong advocate for hunger relief globally, and in the United States. And in that short summer internship with him, it really framed my attention and focus on hunger. And when I was walking to Capitol Hill every day for work, I would pass by the same folks who were unhoused and realized, you know what, I don't need to go to a developing nation to tackle this problem. There's plenty of hunger and food insecurity in our backyard. And that really shaped the trajectory of my career. And then part of it was like, okay, well, what do I do with a background in political science and this newfound concern and interest in hunger? And I found a really wonderful graduate program at Tufts University and their School of Nutrition, Science, and Policy. So that was a really wonderful blend of my background and my interest.
So that after school, what was the path from there?
So did graduate work in Boston, and I chose to get my Ph.D. largely because I wanted to have the skills to be able to quantify and evaluate this otherwise kind of broad, amorphous, like hunger. What does that look like? And I didn't want to just be treating the symptoms of it. I really wanted to identify what works to make things better. So I stayed at Tufts to get my doctoral degree. Yet I did that here in Hartford, Connecticut. And so I did my dissertation work in Hartford, interviewing hundreds of families that were potentially experiencing food insecurity, and asked them questions like, you know, do you participate in public and private food assistance programs? And if not, why not?
Yeah.
And that really gave me a really hands-on experience of really understanding what food insecurity looks like here in the U.S.
And then from there?
And then from there, spent several years at the University of Connecticut. And in that capacity, was often conducting research on food insecurity. So spending time in corner stores, WIC offices, again, having lots of conversations and conducting surveys or focus groups with families that experience food insecurity. And in the process of that time, spent a fair amount of time in food pantries as well. And um, I like the adage that when you've seen one food pantry, you've seen one food pantry. And in that journey, I also had the privilege of partnering with three really cool nonprofit organizations that were planning a different type of food pantry. And that was Food Share, the Regional Food Bank, the Chrysalis Center, and the Junior League of Greater Hartford. And they were preparing to start a new innovative food pantry called Fresh Place that is still at the Chrysalis Center in Hartford. And we conducted the first rigorous evaluation of a food pantry. And by that, I mean, we conducted a randomized control trial. We recruited folks who were going to a few other traditional food pantries in Hartford, and we conducted research with them, asked them survey questions, and then we had them pull a ball out of a bag. And if they got the blue ball, they were said, we'll follow up with you again in a few months to ask you these same questions. And if they pulled the red ball out of the bag, they were invited to go to Fresh Place, which is, um, you had appointments, you didn't have to wait in line. You got to see a case
Hmm.
manager to address the underlying root causes of why they might be experiencing food insecurity. They had classes, full choice, etc. And we found really significant differences between the folks that went to Fresh Place and those that were going to traditional food pantries. And that was in 2010. So we've been continuing to test that model, iterate, learn, adapt, and scale that in other food pantries.
So, Katie, when you say you saw a difference between the ones that were going to Fresh Place versus your traditional food pantries, what do you mean by that? What were you seeing at that point?
Yeah, so the outcomes we're looking at and we continue to look at are things like food security. So our main measure of how often do you worry about having enough food for your family, cutting back on the size of your meals, adults skipping meals or cutting back on the quality of their kids' meals. Like measuring, we saw significant improvements in food security. We saw improvements in self-sufficiency, their ability to make ends meet. We saw improvements in diet quality when folks were getting better, nutritious, healthy food at Fresh Place compared to traditional pre-bagged food items. So things like that.
It's incredible. Um, so then from there,
So there, I continued to work with a lot of food pantries and food banks, and I took the big leap, and then I joined the food bank. So what had been Food Share and now is Connecticut Food Share. I worked there for 5 years and got to see the inside scoop of what it's like to work in a massive warehouse food bank. And in that process, I had continued to visit a lot of food pantries, and what would strike me is I would go to visit a really innovative, awesome food pantry that was just doing lots of great stuff like we had tested at Fresh Place. And then 2 weeks later or 2 miles down the road, I would often go to a food pantry and it was like it was 1992 when I
yeah.
first got started doing this. People waiting in long lines outside in the cold, in the sun, in the heat, in the rain, in the snow, getting to the front of the line and handed a pre-bagged item of food that often could contribute to their chronic disease risk. and they were treated like they should just be grateful for getting the food. And it struck me that, very often food pantries, they're doing this from absolutely very, very good intentions that they want to help their neighbors, but often we don't know what we don't know. And I thought it would be important to shed light on what's possible and what food pantries can look like. So that was what inspired me to write my book. And so I wrote the book, and I dreamed and I prayed a lot that it would make an impact. And I can't tell you um, how humbled I am in hearing how many stories of people who've read my book and are making really impactful changes.
Katie, before we jump to the book, though, um, at what point did you make the leap or make the change to become CEO of More Than Food Consulting?
Yeah, so it'll be 4 years in August. I think that's right. Yeah, 2022. And a lot of it stemmed from mm, with my book. A lot of folks were reaching out to me. They would read my book and they wanted to get additional training, technical assistance. They wanted research to evaluate their programs, and not just here in Connecticut, but around the country and sometimes even internationally. And so that's when I really thought it made sense to start off on my own consulting firm. And it's called
Um,
More Than Food Consulting because it's based on my firm belief that it takes more than food to end hunger.
so yeah, if you want to, what More Than Food Consulting, I can take a guess based on what you've shared, like the highlights of the best programs that you've experienced and worked with since you started your work. But can you tell us more about More Than Food?
Yeah, so we have a framework that, again, is rooted in evidence and research over, I don't know, 15, 20, 30 years of better practices. And we affectionately call these our 3 Cs of culture, choice, and connection. So when we work with food banks and food pantries, often it's on technical assistance and peer learning opportunities so that you design a pantry that's really welcoming, strength based, trauma informed to create a really nice culture. And there are strategies that we have for that. Um, Healthy choice is so critical because traditional food pantries still I would say the majority of food pantries around the country pre-bag their food and do not offer choice or very limited or what we consider modified choice. And what we advocate for, and we have some really strong quantitative and qualitative data to show that when you design a food pantry where neighbors can shop for their food like at a grocery store, it's just a game changer. It's just such a better way, primarily for the neighbors, but also for the volunteers. You reduce food waste, et cetera. And then our third C is connections. And this is, again, going back to it takes more than food, is that in many, many communities around the country, there are not only a whole host of food pantries available, but also many nonprofits and social service organizations that are often serving the same people with very similar missions, but they're often fragmented, siloed, working in isolation. So, in addition to those 3 Cs, we're doing a lot of systems change work where we work with local foundations, philanthropists, or food banks or other coalitions to try to look holistically at their region to say, how do we make these connections stronger between existing food service organizations and nonprofits so that there's a more holistic community resource hub model?
So, Katie, for you, it sounded when I asked that question about your life, where that, your path to now started, it sounded like relatively young you had an idea of, I know you had mentioned the Peace Corps. So where does that side of you come from? Where does that commitment at such a young age to serve those around you, to change the world for the better? Where did that come from in you, whether it was 50-50, nature versus nurture? Did you see it modeled in your family? What was it that kind of guided you in that direction to see it so young that you wanted to make that kind of change?
Yeah, it definitely, came from my parents. I'm sure there were other influences as well, and Tony Hall was a big one. But my parents had role modeled this. My dad was a clinical psychologist. And so, he was really, really skilled at helping folks and just trying to listen and, hear from folks, what their struggles were, what their dreams were, and helping them to navigate that. And my mom, was a nurse by trade. She continues to do community nursing in North Carolina, and she would work with pregnant teenagers when I was young. And so going in and the program was called Nurse Family Partnership, where she would go into families' homes and work with pregnant teenagers to try to help them have strong, healthy birth outcomes and help to advocate for the moms to stay in school and, really live up to their full potential. So, I saw a lot of that in both of my parents. And they also gave me the latitude and the belief that, I could be whatever I wanted to be. And that's a powerful gift to give a kid.
So there was that kind of language when you were growing up about what the possibilities were for you. It wasn't just kind of modeled, but it was also explicitly shared with you. There were conversations, lessons.
Yeah, definitely. That feeling of empowerment of, being able to choose how I wanted to go out into the world, but with a strong emphasis on wanting to make a difference has always been. I feel like they modeled that, but also was close in my heart.
Katie, does it make sense from your childhood that this is what you're doing? Now, based on what you've told me, I can surmise, I take a stab at the answer. Um, but I guess more specifically beyond the response to that is what words do you put to it? What connections do you see between who you were as a kid and the work that you're doing now?
hmm Yeah, when I was in high school, I had no idea that this would be the journey I would be on, but I was always curious and I always wanted, I loved school. So, wanted to learn, wanted to have skills, to be able to make a difference. And I didn't know what that looked like. And, I think for a long time, I looked at the trajectory of my career and it wasn't a straight path as most folks, when you think of your career trajectory, it's very infrequent that it's like, boom, it all lines up. I mean, it was
Yeah.
definitely, as I raised my kids, I worked part time to be home more with my kids. And that's not a traditional professional path when you get a PhD to work part time. Navigating that was tricky. I often felt like I was keeping one foot in the door of my career, so that I could, but it was important for me to have time with my kids. But the through line through it all has been this, just real passion and belief that it's not okay in our wealthy society that there are so many families that have to worry about getting enough food. It's just, it's preventable. It's just not okay. So I've done, sometimes leaning more heavily on research. Now it's more applied research, but that's been my through line.
Can you outline, Katie, just out of curiosity, the changes that you've seen between this industry or segment of community and society to now, aside from kind of the standard bagged apportionment or assortment of food versus the more customized? Is there anything else that stands out to you in terms of how this area of life and community and society has evolved since you started working in it?
Yeah, at the beginning of my book, I have a whole chapter on the history of how we got here. And it's important to note that there's a whole generation of kids these days that have never known a society without food banks and food pantries. That was not always the case. Food banking, the idea, it was piloted and championed in Arizona in 1967, I believe, was the first, in St. Mary's Food Bank. But the movement really took place in the 70s. And then in the early 1980s is when food banks really became institutionalized and part of the fabric of our communities. And that was largely due to policy changes, policy decisions that the Reagan administration made drastic cuts to SNAP, or what had been food stamps at the time. And I think those things are important to note because we're seeing that happen again right now. And back then, we didn't have food banks and food pantries and this charitable food model. A lot of that came out of those policy changes that made
Mm.
it really hard for families to get enough food. It used to be understood that this was the government's responsibility. It's really meant to be, the foundation of a democratic society, of the government's role to make sure that people have their basic needs met. And that is part of a minimum wage and basic food assistance. We have a robust federal food assistance uh, programs, leading with SNAP, but also school lunch, school breakfast, summer meals, WIC program. Like we have these in place, but when those are threatened, when there are cuts, when it's harder for folks to be able to receive those benefits, that's where the charitable food network comes in. And now we have this massive network of food banks and food pantries that are already stretched so thin that it's worrisome to see these changes taking place. So that's part of it. And as you mentioned, like when what I consider the traditional food pantry or food distribution model is volunteers who are well intentioned line up and they prepare identical bags of food for neighbors that are coming. And the idea behind it is, I think, often trying to be equitable or make it equal so that any neighbor coming is that everyone is going to get the same bag of food because that feels equitable. But I don't know about you, John, but I bet if you and I went shopping and our listeners here, if you imagine us all going to the grocery store, the chances of us all walking out with the same bag of food is like ridiculous because we have our own food preferences. So choice is really, really critical. That's something that we're seeing change, but I'm starting to actually get a little punky and a little frustrated with like having to continuously talk about the evidence and the reasons why choice is so important, because the common kickback is, but our volunteers really like this. This is an efficient way to do this. This is how we've always done it. And we've got to lean more into the data and the science behind the benefits of choice.
How long have you been feeling like that?
I'd say in the last, probably since like in the last 3 years of like, we now have data to really, when I wrote the book, I argued that we need more research to actually, like, there's a lot of anecdotal stories about it, but there really wasn't hard data. But I was privileged to partner with Feeding America and about 30 food banks and many, many food pantries around the country with a 3-year grant project through the Morgan Stanley Foundation. And we now have great data to back it up.
What did you see? I can imagine, obviously, during COVID, a major shift in the need. Um, how did this area evolve during the pandemic? Just out of
It
curiosity.
evolved in a few different ways. I think first and foremost, um, many people, many Americans who had never really heard of food insecurity, maybe they never knew about the SNAP program, saw it firsthand. Like they realized, oh my gosh, my childcare provider, my hairdresser, you know, my the store that I love, my restaurant that I, frequent. These are folks that just lost their job overnight. And wow, they're going to have a hard time making ends meet and getting enough food. And we saw the media did a really great job of highlighting the need and the long lines in the food bank lines of cars wrapped around for miles going to get free food. Because I think it took the stigma away from getting help because COVID impacted everybody globally. And it wasn't the fault of an individual that they lost their job or were having a hard time getting enough food. It was this more like societal issue. So food banks and food pantries absolutely responded, but the government did too. And that's really critical. So as much as food insecurity should have skyrocketed during COVID for all of these different reasons, it didn't. It actually decreased slightly because the government stepped up and took away restrictions on food assistance program. They made it so much easier for people to get help. We provided direct assistance for families that were struggling. We put moratoriums on student loans, moratoriums on evictions. We just
Yeah.
said these are challenging times and this is the role of government to step in. They did, and it mattered. And those are the kinds of lessons that I think are important to remember when we think about how can we possibly solve this challenging problem of food insecurity. You know what? We've
Yeah.
done it before.
So for you, how old is your consulting company?
Almost 4 years.
Okay. So yeah, that's right. You mentioned 2022 that More Than Food was founded. So aside from people coming to you, and we'll get to the book in a minute, I promise. Aside from people coming to you and asking about what you've put in the book, everything that you outline in the book, how it works, or any guidance or suggestions you could provide to them, was there anything else that kind of guided you to really pull the trigger and found your own company, your own organization?
Yeah, I think I had already been doing some of this consulting work and it just, it felt like the right time. It felt like there was enough demand for this type of work. Um, and so I took the leap.
That's amazing. I mean, especially, did you think about just the uncertainty of COVID? It's towards the back end of COVID that it was founded, but did that play into your mind, or was just kind of like you saw that there was a need, you were passionate enough about it, and you figured you'd take the jump?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I think sometimes um, if I had thought about it more and like known all the things that would be involved with starting my own firm, I probably would have delayed longer. So sometimes it's good to just, just take the risk and take the leap of faith. And it's worked out.
Katie, what do you consider your superpower?
Mm.
Like someone can tell me their story, their work, the good work that they're doing, but I'm always curious what they kind of attribute all of it to, or most of it, whatever the case may be. But what is that one thing that they say, this is the one thing that I can deliver almost better than anything that stands out like that?
I think, you know, I think I help inspire folks to think differently. And what I hear a lot of times when I do keynote speeches or I do presentations, people will say they can tell how passionate I am about this topic. And, clearly you can hear that too. I think that helps inspire folks because I'm really clear on why this matters to me. And, I try to weave that in throughout my work. Like, it's at the end of the day, it's just not okay that so many millions of Americans in our wealthy society have to worry about making sure that their kids have enough food. And that grounds me and that centers me in all the other things that I do. And I think, you know, it helps inspire people to think differently when they can hear how passionate I am about it.
Absolutely. I can obviously in the story you tell what you thought about when you were going into college, just what you saw right away, your family being of service itself, your parents. I mean, that's just a story that just evolves and unwinds into what you're sharing with us today. And then, Katie, before we jump into the book, what does leadership mean to you? How would you describe it? What does great leadership look like?
I think leadership, it involves being curious and trying to bring out the best in others. So I'm fortunate I have a team of awesome staff members that work with me. I don't do this work alone. And while folks will reach out often to us because they want my involvement in a project, I try to empower my team and, others to be spokespersons for More Than Food Consulting. We do a lot of peer learning. So where we have expertise and information that we can share, but I think true leaders help to set the stage so other people can shine as well. So it's about being curious and creating space for other people to be their best selves as well.
Now, Katie, we can jump into the book. Why don't you introduce the book with the full title? Um, and then kind of give a little more background to how the book came to be. You had mentioned obviously people had reached out to you about what you were doing, the work you were doing, the programs that you were helping with. Um, but aside from the title, what was it that really pushed you to actually write the book? What was that moment or that period in time that really convinced you, okay, I need to commit this to a book?
Yeah. I'm really close with my family, and I was visiting my mom and couple sisters in North Carolina years ago, and I was talking about my work and how passionate I am about that idea of there's so much great work happening, and yet there's still so many pantries that are just stuck in old school thinking and old ways of doing it. And I think I want to write a book someday. And my mom said, write it down, and I actually have a napkin from a barbecue joint in North Carolina. I said, I want to write a book to change the way that we think about the issue of hunger in America. And I think that was actually like 9 years before the book actually came out. So and that's where it's important. I'm also a big fan of um, being intentional and manifesting and, like verbalizing the things that you really want, putting it out there, and then especially if you can hold yourself accountable by sharing it with others that are close to you, that then they can say, all right, Katie, remember you wrote that down. You were talking about writing a book. And then
Yeah.
I, yeah, so here is I love the cover of my book too,
Yeah, so do I. It stands
the
out. And
reinventing.
I laugh when you were saying that about telling others because that's how I know how serious I might be about something where there's like phases or levels.
Yeah,
Level 1 is kind of like you keep it up here in your head.
yeah,
Level 2 is like you speak it to yourself, or the
yeah,
next level, you speak it to yourself because there's a major difference when you say it out loud,
yeah,
when you can kind of hear it back to yourself. And then the next level is really when you mention it to close friends and family. And then the next level when you put something on LinkedIn. So that's the only reason I laugh is because I'm aware of those levels of, okay, how serious is this idea?
yeah,
How serious am I about really writing that book or doing that project or launching something? So I
yeah,
appreciate you sharing just that power of really putting it out there, talking
yeah.
it out, sharing it with family, writing it on a barbecue covered napkin, whatever,
Mhm.
whatever it may be.
Yeah. And I think, especially because this podcast is really geared towards a lot of authors that have written books, I think it could be helpful too. Like when I started to write the book, I found myself writing the same paragraph over and over again. And finally, I was like, oh my God, what am I doing? This book is never going to expand if I'm just rewriting the same thing over and over. And I think it was because I was trying to write for everybody. Because, of course, I want politicians to read this. I want philanthropists to read this. I want food pantries and food banks and academics. And I want everybody. I want folks going through the airport reading my book. But then when you're trying to be everything to everybody, you're not often very good
Yeah.
at any of it. So then
Yeah.
I got really clear on who my audience is. And for this book, it was really folks who are working and volunteering in food banks and food pantries. That was my key audience. And I know those people because I was working at a food bank, had been partnering with a lot of other food banks, and I had visited dozens and dozens of food pantries around the country. And then the writing just flowed. And then when I really got serious about writing the book, I had no idea what it would be like to get it published and what that process was like. I reached out to a colleague, Mark Winnie, who used to run the Hartford food system in Hartford. And some of your listeners may be familiar with Mark. He's a fantastic human being, and he had authored a few books. And I reached out to him, and he was so great. He's like, "Of course you should write a book." And he introduced me to he at least gave name of his publisher that he had worked with. And I emailed her with a proposal on a Sunday afternoon. And I thought, I'll probably have to reach out to dozens of publishers. And she emailed me back Monday morning and said, I'm intrigued. You know, I want to learn more. So, yeah,
Can you hold up the book again? Katie,
yes.
I'm sorry I cut you off before. I was curious. And okay, yeah.
So
Um,
Island Press, and they're the ones that found the artist to design the book cover, which I just love.
so so that came up about 9 or 10 years ago that the idea kind of hit you. The book came out in when?
2021.
2021.
So it's
So
4 years, it's 5 years old.
so from the time that you mentioned it to your family, you put it down on the napkin, um, what was that process like between when you did that to the publishing? Obviously, I know sometimes it takes a couple years for people to be like, okay, now I need to get to this. But what was your process like? Were you writing that entire time from when you told your
Ooh,
mom or your
no.
family to when you put it out, or did you pick it up years later? Like, what did the writing look like?
Yeah, it was many I that really it was just kind of a pie in the sky, put it on the napkin, put the napkin in a drawer and kind of forgot it. It was just very much in the back of my mind.
Yeah.
And then at a certain point I was like, this has got to happen. And then I was about to turn 50 and I was like, if I'm going to write this, that would be nice to, like try to do this by the time I'm 50. And so I started really writing in January of 2019, signed the contract with Island Press in November of 2019, and we set a deadline for June of 2020 to finish the book. So, I mean, it was a very quick time frame, and I had been writing a bit over the summer, but I was like, I'm ready. At that point, I was really ready to go. And the timing is very serendipitous because obviously if my book had come out right when COVID hit, it, it would have gotten lost in all of that. I feel fortunate that I was able to incorporate some of the early lessons of COVID-19 in the book, like that immediate response of, holy crap, all of our pants are on fire.
Yeah.
This is crazy. And then, you know, because things turned upside down, I asked for a 1 month extension from my publisher to extend it to July of 2020 to finish the book. And I feel really fortunate because I was still writing and finishing up the book when we witnessed the murder of George Floyd. And I had already embedded, you know, language about systemic racism and structural injustices. But I think that helped me push it even a little bit further of really calling that out. Um, so I finished in July of 2020, and then it takes months for it to like actually, come out like this. So it was March of 2021. And I think the other kicker there is my book is all about change. It's not theoretical. It's not super academic. It's very conversational about changes that any individual could make in their community today. So I advocate for a lot of changes. And I think prior to COVID, folks might have read it and just said, that sounds nice, Katie, but this is how we've always done it. We can't change the way we did it. But COVID taught us all that we can do things we never thought we could do before. COVID flipped everything upside down. So again, serendipity that I think many more people were open-minded to like, well, we've already changed everything. Why not
Yeah.
make some more changes?
So, Katie, how do you lay out the book? Can you give an overview? What's the path you put the reader on to get to that end result, that end idea and belief that you want them to take on? How did you decide how to structure it? What is that path you lead them on? You don't have to read every title, but how did you organize the book in such a way to convince somebody of the good work they're doing, what is left to do, how it can be done, however you want to share it?
Yeah. So as I described, chapter 2 is the history of food assistance programs. So like really, how do we get here? How do we get to this place? So there's an intro that kind of frames the whole book, but really quickly, it's like, here's how we got here. And I think it's eye-opening for folks to know about that history. And then every chapter, there is a theme. It's meant that the goal of the book is bold yet simple. It's to change the way that we think about the preventable problem of hunger and then to provide tangible, practical action steps that folks can take today in their community. So it starts off with things like creating a welcoming culture at a food pantry, and then choice, and then connections, the role of volunteers, the importance of data collection. And then, so I start with kind of like easy things that most food pantries are already thinking about, already doing. And then I try to build from there. And then I get more um, systemic and big picture of, structural inequalities and systems change, collective impact. How can we coordinate services among different nonprofits and thinking differently of the whole system within a region? And new partners, new opportunities to collaborate. So that's kind of that's the trajectory of how I walk folks through.
Katie, I'm a novice when it comes to this area. Um, when it comes to customizing, giving more options, creating a certain environment, obviously that takes more money, I would believe, than the standard food pantries of yesterday, right?
Hmm.
So what does that look like in terms of funding? What does that look like in terms of resources? Just in general, you don't have to go into specifics, but how much more is required, even as a percentage, or however you want to break this down? This is your
Yeah.
world, this is not mine. But I'm curious kind of what sets those two worlds apart, aside from the attention, aside from the studies, aside from the acknowledgement that there needs to be something different. What does that mean in terms of funding and resources to kind of make that change, to make that shift?
Yeah. It's a great question. I would say, just to back that up, like I think the biggest change that's required is the mindset. So I write about the scarcity mentality that is pervasive in the nonprofit sector, and very pervasive within food banks and food pantries. The idea that we don't have enough, dot, 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 fill in the blank, volunteers, space, time, food, money, we don't have enough. And it's interesting because you can understand that from the neighbor perspective, from the folks that we're trying to help. It's easy to see if you're food insecure, if you're dealing with poverty, of course you've got a scarcity mentality because you're just trying to make ends meet today, tomorrow, the end of the week. But as nonprofits, when we lean too much on that scarcity mentality, it holds us back from dreaming bigger, from thinking differently about our grant writing, about the programs that we, are offering. I think there are a lot of funders. It's exciting to me. We're partnering with a few philanthropic organizations who, quite honestly, are kind of tired of reading the same grant proposals with that scarcity mentality. We're just trying to fix the old fridge because the fridge broke and we need to fix it again. And we're feeding the hungry and we're continuing to feed the hungry. They're looking for different dialogue too. And I think as you do these better practices and you dream bigger and you have more of an abundance mindset of recognizing not only are we going to dream bigger, but we're going to partner with other folks. And in collaboration with others, that's going to make us stronger together. Then you're writing grant proposals that are talking about disease prevention, health promotion, reducing stress and mental illness, and really thinking more holistically, trying to make it easier for neighbors to navigate a fragmented system. That gets funders thinking differently because I talk a lot, I understand that times are tough. There is money out there. And I would encourage folks that are saying, and maybe are skeptical, yeah, that sounds good, Katie. Trust me, there are a lot of organizations, individual donors, financial donors, foundation staff that are willing to fund these bigger enterprises.
Katie, I'm always curious with the authors that I bring on the series that I host. How did you evolve? How did your thinking evolve during the writing of this book? Obviously, this is your wheelhouse, has been for decades at this point. You had mentioned how, with the timing of the pandemic and then obviously the murder of George Floyd, how it kind of the urgency was there, but shifted the urgency. I can only imagine what the language would have been, and then just how much it elevated it because of the events that were taking place. Aside from that, though, how did you change in writing this book? How did your thinking change? What evolved in you? Not so much in the technical writing of the book or the process, but what changed the most in you because of the book being published?
Yeah, I continue to approach equity, diversity, inclusion with a sense of cultural humility. Like I am a white woman of privilege, and as much as I feel like I know a lot about what makes food pantries and food banks work, and I've spent a lot of time with, individuals who experience food insecurity, I don't know what it's like to walk in their shoes every day. And so trying to continuously reevaluate my own thinking, my own writing to try to lean more into how might I look at this from an equity lens? How might I, if somebody else were reading this, walking in very different shoes, how would they view this? And how do I try my best to say, and just put it from that systems lens as opposed to just here are organizational changes that can take place. I give a lot of practical examples of how organizations can change, but changing systems is challenging. And um, I love gathering examples of great work that's happening. That's a lot of the work that I'm doing now because I know there's a lot of great work happening in terms of systems change, collaborative work, um, more EDI examples. And so the more that I can continuously be curious and asking those questions and learning from others so that I can share that out that's what helps me do my work better.
Katie, not sure. The book came out a couple of years ago. Not sure what you're up to now in terms of writing, but do you have plans to kind of do any kind of writing, additional books in the future, anything that you're working on?
That's a great question. I do think about that, and it's possible. We're quite busy at More Than Food Consulting. We have a monthly newsletter that we offer for free. We have bi-monthly webinars that we conduct, and we've got a few big research projects that we're doing right now. So I feel like I've got a fair amount on my plate, but yeah, I,
Yeah.
I I appreciate the question.
Um, what books stand out to you? Obviously, we're here talking about your book, but then what books have stood out to you that you've read that have been, if I brought you back on for an episode, which you're more than welcome to come back, what book would you pick? Which one has really shaped your thinking or the way that you live or work or conduct business, whatever it may be?
There are so many. A few that come to mind. Poverty by America is a really compelling book about structural racism. Rethinking by Adam Grant is a great one of just, how do we just continuously keep an open mind and stay
Yeah.
curious?
Yeah.
I've also been influenced recently. I don't know if you can call it a book. It's more of a monograph. It's really short. It's called The Flat Org Chart by Dan Pallotta, and it argues that this notion that if we look at in any community, there are so many nonprofits and social service organizations, et cetera. But if you put them on an org chart, they would be completely flat because they're not partnering and there's no overarching anchor organization that's leading the charge. And that's been influencing my work as I try to, move more towards systems change and encouraging organizations to partner more, collaborate more with one another. How do we get to that bigger change? So I think the flat org chart has just been, it's a very quick read, but that's been influencing my work.
Katie, for you, obviously, we've learned the nature of your work, the mission of the book. I'm of the mindset that regardless of the field of a book or the area of a book, I think it's valuable to read anything from any area, even if it doesn't relate to me specifically, or even if I'm not interested in it, I can pick something up from anything I read. For you, even if somebody says, this book doesn't apply to me, um, what would you say to them in terms of what they can learn from this book? You've outlined great lessons that you infused in here, but how would you share it with somebody where they think it may not apply to them. What kind of
Mhm.
lessons are in there?
Yeah. I mean, I think what's fascinating is how many people are actually involved in anti-hunger work in one way or another. They, maybe not formally, but how many people donate food to a food drive every year? How many people, volunteer periodically at a food bank or food pantry? It's a much larger group of people than we sometimes realize. So, if anyone is concerned about food insecurity and maybe they're hearing some of this on the news, they're hearing like this fall when the government shut down and folks were not going to be able to receive their SNAP benefits. I had many people who don't know much at all about my work who were contacting me like, "Hey, Katie, I heard about the SNAP cuts and this is going to really impact folks in my community." I'm like, "Hey, this is good news." I think more and more people realize how close to home it really is for folks. So I think if you're concerned at all about this as an issue in our society, because it's just not okay and it's very preventable, I think there's a lot of aha moments that people may not have thought about before.
Katie, in wrapping up, you've shared so much, but is there anything that I may not have asked? Anything you want to cover? Anything that I missed? Anything at all? The floor is yours.
Well, I really appreciate this opportunity to have this stage and just to have a great conversation with you. Um, I would encourage folks to check out our website. It takes more than food.org. We've got free resources, information there. And like I said, we have a free newsletter, free webinars. And if you're interested in doing more, reach out to us. We'd love, or if you're like, I have a great example of the stuff that we're doing at our food pantry, our food bank, and our community, we also love to highlight those in our work. So reach out. Happy to connect.
Yeah, it's been interesting to follow you on LinkedIn and see all the different locations and
Mm.
pantries throughout the country that you go to visit. So it's incredible to see that kind of commitment that you have getting out there in those communities, even when they're outside your immediate community. So I think that's incredible.
I guess the other thing that I would say is it's been so exciting for me. The book's been out 5 years just to see how much change is happening. Like it really is a movement. And like the more folks that can join the movement, the better. So change is possible and it's happening.
And again, Katie shared her book, Reinventing Food Banks and Pantries, New Tools to End Hunger. Katie, thank you so much for being here for this conversation.
Thank you, John.
And if there's anything I might have missed, so much to cover, so little time, please let me know. I'll see what kind of insights, guidance, wisdom, knowledge, anything additional I can get from Katie in response. In the meantime, thank you for watching, listening, and subscribing, and I'll talk to you soon. Take care. Bye.